Welcome to the Startup Operator Podcast. I'm Roshan Cariappa. Imagine selling a new product or building in a new market. It's hard enough. But now imagine that most people think your product is illegal or even dangerous. That takes it to a whole other level of difficult. Although hemp belongs to the cannabis family and is related to marijuana, that most people recognize as a narcotic drug, it has nothing to do with getting high, but instead has a wide range of potential applications, from fiber for shoes or shirts to treating medical ailments such as arthritis. Bombay Hemp Company, or Boheco as it's called, is pioneering the production and use of hemp in the country. I spoke to Jahan, Peston, Jamas, who is one of the founders, on how they're building in this nascent category, working on everything from production and distribution to even policy making, just through first principles with sheer grit, tenacity, and innovation. This was a fascinating conversation, and there are tons of insights in here on executing in a new space, in a new market. So let's dive into this episode of the Startup Operator Podcast with Jahan of Boheco. Hi, Jahan. Welcome to the Startup Operator Podcast. Thank you so much for making the time.
Hi, Roshan. The pleasure is all mine and all ours at Boheco, and really glad to be part of this conversation, the Startup Operator Podcast, and looking forward to some engaging discussions today.
Yeah, for sure. I have been super intrigued by what you guys are doing. It's not often that, people decide to start a hemp company, right? So, let's start there actually. So how did you start the Bombay Hemp Company? What was the founding story like? How do you go from idea to product to company?
That's a great question. Thank you so much for that, Roshan. And I think just to trace back, Boheco story is almost about 9 years old, but the origin of the idea was born in college, where all of us co-founders, not that time co-founders, but later on down the line, all of us were part of a lot of extracurricular and sort of cultural activities where we spent a lot of time outside the classroom as much as we did in it during our senior college days. We were very fortunate enough that we got exposed to missions like what we used to call SIFE, Students in Free Enterprise. They call it Inactus now. And we were part of a core team working on a project called Project Chirag, which the goal was sort of a 5-point rural transformation program that we were aiming to initiate as college students, starting with solar electrification, working on affordable lanterns and providing them at nominal cost to villages all across India. But that led to two sort of serendipitous moments. The first was domestically in India. The second was internationally in Australia. Domestically in India, whenever we used to travel and break our necks traveling to Uttarakhand, Rajasthan, Maharashtra, the interiors. We saw every 100 kilometers, the language, custom, culture, everything was changing. But the one constant that we saw everywhere was cannabis was growing wild. So it really got our juices stirring, say, okay, hold on. Is there an opportunity being missed by this being latently just growing in the wild? The only people who come to kind of search and destroy the narcotics officers, of course, because it's a wild crop. And on occasion, the villagers had a subsistence use depending upon the custom culture of the state. So that kind of got us thinking that is there sort of an untapped pool of hidden resources in plain sight that we could capitalize on and be able to use that to reform and transform how Indian agriculture has been working over the course of time. About a month or two after our first couple of expeditions, when it first clicked, I traveled to West Australia to meet my relatives. And we were traveling across the rural part of West Australia. That's past Perth, etc. And what very few people know is the rural outback in West Australia has been divided for a long time. The drug problems, the alcohol problems, lack of income, lack of productivity. We kept going through town after town, and we came across this one town called Margaret River, which stood out as an anomaly. Everyone is prosperous, there's development. You see the signs of how development is happening. You see this sort of vigor amongst people. So I was curious. I went to a couple of locals and I asked them, what are you doing differently? There's a town about 10 kilometers away from you that's broke. It's defunct, it's bankrupt. They said, we do two things different. We grow grapes for wine, and today Margaret River is one of the top wine counties in the world alongside the likes of Napa, etc. And we grow hemp or cannabis for everything else. When I asked them a bit more, they said, look, we take the fiber, we make our surfboards out of it, we make our clothes out of it. We use the seed as a seed and seed oil in our salads. It's a superfood as good as flax, if not better than that. And we found different medical and sort of pharmaceutical uses even from the flower. And after being stunned by this, I went back, I did a little research and realized they weren't the only ones. They weren't an anomaly in this larger world. It was the United States, it was Canada, it was China who had been working on 15-year-long plans to do this. And naturally it begged the question, if cannabis historically grew in the Himalayas, shouldn't India reclaim its right to a crop that grew in its own backyard rather than being pushed to the side because of certain dogmas or certain sort of cultural inhibitions. Brought the idea back to the team in college days. We said, okay, let's be wise about this. This is in the Bollywood film. We can't jump straight into it. Let's take a couple of years out of college, build our chops, get that white collar experience, understand how processes, systems, organizations work. Where all of us worked in different domains, some at organizations like Deloitte. I personally undertook another startup. Some of them worked in packaging, logistics, and we all came together after a couple of years and said, now is the time for us to really explore this. This is the end of 2012. And that's when 2013 Boheco was born, or Bombay Hemp Company was born, where we decided that if we don't do it, someone else will. And if someone else will, we don't know what destined pathway that will lead to. And we understood it's important to be able to do something right as much as it is to do it fast. And sometimes with something that attaches itself to the apex of controversy, something like cannabis that could trigger, it is very important to begin building the foundation and the base blocks. And touch wood, today the industry is growing at, I would say, a very rapid pace, day on day, month on month. A lot more companies, organizations, stakeholders who we've been kind of engaging with. And that's sort of where the origins of it began, where we realized the first thing we need to do is understand, is it even legal to do this? So we began knocking the doors of policymakers. I remember we had reached out to a senior agriculture policymaker, and it took me almost 65 mails, cold mails, to get one meeting. That one meeting lasted 6-7 minutes, but it changed our perspective. It helped us understand the sheer value of what we'd be able to do strategically. For example, an alternative natural fiber to cotton and jute, alternative oilseed to oilseeds that are not even native to India, having alternative medical or horticulture plants, all coming from one plant. That in turn led to another batch of meetings where we're very fortunate that basically cannabis comes under the Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances Act, or the NDPS Act of 1985, which has been in the news a lot over the last couple of years for completely unrelated reasons. We were very fortunate at that time. We actually got an opportunity to meet with the Director of Narcotic Control, that is the main policymaker behind the act, as well as his senior bureaucrats, and actually have a 2-hour presentation, which is, as I'm sure many startups have seen, it's impossible to get a senior bureaucrats 2 hours of their time. But they were so wrapped in and engaged that we understood that, okay, there's potential here. And the clear message from the government right from the onset was, it's not if, it's when and how we do this, which is most important. And that's where stakeholders working together becomes critical. So I guess that's sort of a brief background of where we came from when we began work.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Weed is a very or cannabis or weed, whatever we call it. I mean, it's a very non-fussy crop that way, right? I mean, it doesn't require much to grow, really. But you did mention, all of the misnomers surrounding, cannabis itself, right? And hemp belongs to the same family, but of course is has a lower THC, and so it's not something you can get high off of, right? So there is a lot of educating the market that you have to do, right? And you've invested a bunch of time on that, and your mission itself is to educate, cultivate, and elevate. Could you talk about that? The fact that you're early in a market and you're having to educate customers, policymakers, various businesses, etc.
Absolutely, that's a great question, and thanks so much for that, Roshan. Educate, cultivate, elevate has been the ethos by which we work, because we understood education and awareness was a 360-degree phenomenon with the ecosystem we are working in. We had to educate policymakers and regulators. Like to give a and I think you hit the nail on the head when you said, cannabis and hemp coming from the same family. A lot of people have difficulty distinguishing between the two. And we use a very, very simple analogy. Think of a domestic cat in your house and think of a wild tiger in the jungle. Both come from the same family. One of them is already domesticated, one may need generations to domesticate. And that's how these two kind of come from the same family, how a high THC or a high potentially intoxicating plant compared to a low THC plant would actually work out an equivalent. And this is the same example we used with policymakers, scientists, academia, researchers, and really got them curious and interested to see how this can be profiled in a much larger fashion. But equally important were two other stakeholders at the back of the value chain, that is the farming communities, the agrarian and the artisan communities, to be able to help them build a strong story around how they've historically used hemp. For example, in small areas in Punjab, they still use the hemp seed oil, the seed oil from the hemp seed, or what they call bhang ki beej, to cure stretch marks. And it's sort of a cultural knowledge passed down from generation to generation. Or if you go to rural Uttarakhand, you will get bhang ki beej or hemp seed chutney. It's a very common phenomenon, kumauni chutney, etc. They used to use the fiber to tie cattle and make their jutis, make the sweaters when it was cold. So the subsistence knowledge was there. But how do you take that into the mainframe and link to the front end of integration? That is the consumers. the SEC A plus, the SEC A is sitting in tier one and tier two cities in India. And that itself was one of the key areas that we anticipated will be the most education awareness required. And I got a couple of amusing anecdotes also on this front. So when we started, we used to do a lot of offline marketing and business development. You'd be at your flea markets, your open exhibitions, all of these types of varieties of events. And I remember the first time we had done an event somewhere around Bombay, and it was searing heat. And it was in a very affluent part of Bombay, I won't name it. And we were there for 3-4 hours. We had a range of products. So when we began, we started with only one product. That was a white hemp shirt. Just like this material, this is actually made of hemp fiber as well. That time we had only one product and we expanded into hemp food-based products, hemp seed oil, etc. But a lot of this was actually educating using even other products and formulations to show people what the wide scope was as well. So at this sort of flea market, we had this lady come up to us and ask, "Ye kya hai? What is this?" So we said, we took 10-15 minutes, explain hemp, cannabis, non-narcotic, narcotic, very good for you, like us, etc. The end of it, she asked one thing. She said, "I thought ham was non-veg." She mistook ham for hemp. And that is the baseline we actually had to begin with. And I remember another anecdote. A couple of my founders were in Goa meeting with a very senior architect. And that time we'd collaborated with a company globally to actually use the hemp fiber to make hemp cream, that is building material, as sort of a prototype and showpiece to help people understand the scope. And I remember the architects, they went through the entire presentation. At the end of it, seriously, a couple of the team asked, "Look, if this house is made of hemp and it gets on fire, will we get high?" And that's when you had to say, "Look, your priority isn't that at that moment." And no, you won't. So that is the baseline level we really had to start with. But the journey has been ascending very rapidly. And I think due to hyper digitization, when people are watching other countries do this, it's not just the United States or Europe anymore. Today it's Thailand and China and Australia and more relatable, associatable economies, where people are seeing how hemp and hemp seed oil is used in cosmetics and food. Today we have, sort of even our patients for some of our cannabis leaf-based CBD and THC formulations, the Ayurvedic formulations, are coming from far off places like Tanakpura in Uttarakhand, Firozpur in Punjab, rural parts of Meghalaya, rural parts of Andhra Pradesh and Telangana. So the movement has spread far and wide, but there is a continuous need for rapid education. And I'd like to just trace back also to how the education became an important phenomenon even with policymakers and stakeholders. Remember, I had met a chief minister back in the day, and this is Chief Minister of Uttarakhand, Harish Rawatji at that time. What had happened was when Uttarakhand was born as one of the later states, they created a policy allowing local communities to use the wild fiber and seed. But as we know, you take anything from the wild, you won't get standard yield or output. And that's always going to be a problem to scale the industry. So we worked very closely with his chief secretary at that time, senior forest officers, and finally got a meeting with him at 11 o'clock at night at his house. What we decided to do is we said, let's play it smart. We got his measurements and sizes done. We got a kurta made for him, and we got shoes made out of hemp fiber for him. We presented him a kit. Immediately he wore it, all of it, and he said, "This is what I'm going to show everyone when I talk about this." It's the same phenomena that was replicated now with a very good friend of ours, formerly a member of parliament, Tathagat Satpathy from Odisha, from Biju Janata Dal at that time. I remember it was a discussion about Jammu and Kashmir that was happening on the floor of the parliament house. Of course, unrelated to us, and then I started getting a clamor of calls in the evening. What we had done is we had sent him a hemp shirt, hemp kurta, and we really educated him about how cannabis, because he's one of the first MPs who actually spoke vociferously about the positive effects of cannabis and hemp. And he was so happy to work with us and collaborate with us that he actually wore a hemp kurta to parliament that day. And he said, "What is bhang in your mind? What's ganja in your mind?" He said, "What if we could use this bhang or ganja that made this kurta to revitalize economies like Jammu and Kashmir, revitalize northeastern economies?" And next thing you know, 10 MPs from 10 different parties come to him after that session and said, "What material is this? Where did you get this from? Can you make a kurta for me?" And little by little, it began to permeate and percolate, where today you have a wide swath of knowledge, which is we're very fortunate that, we work very actively on this, but we also many other stakeholders play their part. For example, we've had senior bureaucrats wear hemp shirts and go to the National Academy of Customs, Excise and Narcotics, where they train narcotic officers and said, "What does ganja mean to you? What does bhang mean to you?" He said, "Okay, this plant, this illegal season." He said, "What if I tell you it's a shirt? What I'm wearing is ganja." They said, their minds are blown. And then that is the level and baseline we started to build this awareness and narrative, where today there is a lot more maturity about it. And I think it's beautifully echoed by the end of 2020, when the India at the United Nations Commission on Narcotics Drugs actually voted to reschedule cannabis from the hardest schedule, Schedule 4, that says it has no medical use up to Schedule 1 to say it has medical and therapeutic use along with the industrial use from the fiber, from the seed, etc. This is a huge win because what people don't know was India's vote was a kingmaker vote. If India chose not to vote like that, the next 8 years would be cannabis still being scheduled like that. It was India, Nepal, and Thailand that chose to vote in favor. And shows us how far we've come over an 8-9 year journey where consumers, patients, doctors, academicians, scientists who we work with who are actually breeding cannabis and researching on cannabis, understanding how THC, CBD, fiber, seed, etc. work, are themselves becoming experts, educators, and being able to build the larger ecosystem in narrative. So I think that was the key behind education, because without education, it would be impossible to have licenses and laws by which you can legally cultivate. And it's only through cultivation and the scale of cultivation that you could actually elevate the rural communities that may be lacking further opportunities as well. So that is sort of how the ethos and philosophy of how education and cultivation as well as elevation worked at Boheco from the onset.
Amazing. It's incredible to see your passion. But, the customer acquisition must be fairly tricky, right? Because, I mean, if I were to draw an analogy, I mean, it's almost like somebody discovered plastic and now has to make objects out of plastic and tell people that this is how it can be used, right? So people aren't really looking for hemp products per se, right? I mean, but they are looking for shirts and they are looking for, whatever else objects can be made out of hemp. So I wonder if you can take us through, how your customer acquisition works.
So I think the evolution of customer acquisition began from what was a very complex labyrinth, where even, say, for example, online marketing on your Facebook or your Instagram back in the day was limited only to your hemp textiles because, of course, those are recognized, or hemp-based foods or seeds. The moment you spoke about CBD, THC, medical use of cannabis, etc., ads got taken down. You saw promotions sort of getting sidelined, etc. But what I think plays a key part into this is the global developments and evolution. For example, FDA approving medical cannabis-based drugs. Canada and United States having multiple medical cannabis laws where originally their terms and conditions kind of arise from. So the world we began in back in the day in terms of customer acquisition and marketing is a whole different world to where it is now as well. And we're seeing it gradually evolve. And that's where we always had different, I would say, different compartments of different products. We had your textiles, sort of your fiber, just skin touching. You had your foods that were going into your body but had no narcotic value. And now you have your Ayurvedic medicines, which take conventional pathways. But over the course of time, what may have begun from just basic Facebook ads or getting in online, today we're listed on almost 45 to 50 different online platforms, your Farmsies, your Amazons, etc. But these are complex pieces of work where we need to build proper compliance, proper dossier to show how we're compliant with the ever-evolving global as well as the Indian laws. And most importantly, we realize, as you correctly said, is it a pull mechanism or is it a push mechanism? What type of mechanism are we looking to use to actually draw eyeballs to us? So for the longest time, it was a lot about pulling people, sort of pushing people with hemp and cannabis. But then gradually we realized that, hey, there are existing alternatives. There are larger spaces like your sustainable nutrition space, your sustainable fashion and lifestyle space, your need for some types of Ayurvedic and medical intervention space where modern medicine requires a complement to Ayurveda. And being able to cater to those narratives became very critical for us. So today we have a 360-degree customer acquisition strategy where we have online as well as offline strategies that work in tandem, and we have sort of a dual engine approach. Online, we work a lot on content development, video creation, creating a lot of, I would say, animated pictorials representing stories and narratives that aren't only just about hemp and cannabis, because the biggest catch-22 is if you keep doing that, you're only going to speak to the same audience. How do you expand your audience and expand your pool? You need to be able to find ways to tactically piggyback on relevant concepts where hemp or cannabis has the right positive messaging. And that's where, for example, your hemp seed versus your alsi bleach or your pumpkin seed or your plant-based protein, being able to build a narrative around how hemp-based foods are working into that domain, or working how hemp-based textiles are your eco-friendly, fashionable, sustainable alternative to your cottons or your linens or jutes, and being able to build a story around how this is ours, this is homegrown, this is domesticated, and being able to really take the story backwards. For example, when we started, we used to make handloom textile products, your shows, your stores, mandis, and in partnership with a lot of farming, artisan, and collector groups in rural Uttarakhand. One of the activities we used to do is we used to connect the farmers and artisans via a video chat with the customer directly. So the customer knows who's making it. They finally have a story. They finally have emotion. And that emotion amplifies when you have a rural community woman who's almost never used a phone for video call in her life, seeing this foreign woman absolutely elated about a product she would never have found in her conventional marketplace globally, of course. And domestically, it was the key part was being able to have consistency as well as uniqueness and innovative in the right messaging. So the key behind messaging was working with thought leaders, key opinion leaders, having ambassadors who would actually not just take it up as a blind endorsement, but actually believe in the concept, believe in the lifestyle and product, being able to cater that messaging to their larger audiences. Where today, we have multiple campaigns with multiple influencers online as well as offline. And even what we see in offline in terms of our acquisition strategy, we realize it also goes a step further, because first we were working in textiles, cosmetics, and food products. Today we also have Ayurvedic proprietary medicines. We're working on different topical as well as consumption-based prescription products, and the marketing also links into people, thought leaders, and medical practitioners. Your Ayush practitioners or modern medical practitioners who are your first point of call for any patient, saying, "Doctor, what should I use? How should I use this? When should I use this? What's the dosing? What are the side effects? What are the medications should I take?" And being able to convey the right messaging, building the data that convinces your experts and your scientific experts that, okay, you know what, this is worth a shot, me just recommending to my patient, and allowing the results to speak for themselves. Where I remember I sort of lead a doctor outreach team along with a lot of the policy and the research work. One of the modern medicine doctors we work with, he had one patient, an 83-year-old grandmother with rheumatoid arthritis for about 35, 40 years, and the pain was unbearable. And of course, what we did was, he said, "Look, let me just give you this topical arthritis product. It combined leaf extract with a hemp seed oil. You just apply it for a couple of weeks. Let's see how we go." This is the first batch of call where you have to provide them samples, you have to answer them questions, really build the technical notes and expertise that they're looking for. Safety, not toxic, and it actually works. She came back within 5 days, called him at 11 o'clock at night, said, "Meet me at your clinic now." And he said, "Okay, fine." He was very worried. She came to the clinic, he came to the clinic, and she said, "First of all, what miracle have you given me? In 40 years, I've never felt this way." And that one lady has now resulted in a colony of almost a few thousand people, of which a few hundred have arthritis, buying that product and purchasing the product. So the equal importance to building around influencers with larger audiences was equally complemented around building micro influential communities, telling the stories. Where today we have a batch of video series coming up telling stories of the everyday Joes, the people like just you and I and beyond. Your mid-age SEC, A, B plus B bankers working, government banks using these products and seeing the relief. And being able to have that kind of connect between these two, we realize is the golden apex of how customer acquisition needed to work, where we could not ignore one side for the other. We always had to keep a dual engine system running, whether online by reaching out through multiple channels, where we have our own websites, we list on other portals, we work with other Ayurvedic platforms, and as well as other Ayurvedic online doctor communities, as well as taking this offline into clinics and pharmacies and hospitals. So it was sort of like a dual engine approach, but it's been very rewarding and an extremely good learning experience for us so far.
Hi, you can get back to the podcast in less than a minute, but before that, remember when news wasn't in your face and out to get you? Much of what qualifies as news today are clickbaity headlines, unresearched opinions, and unnecessary speculation. News used to be boring. And that's why you should subscribe to The Boring News at boringnews.co. You get one free daily email newsletter with a fact-first bullet-style reporting that focuses on informing you on all things relevant. The writing style gives it to you straight. They don't have a voice. Why? Because in their words, if you can be trusted to vote at 18, we trust you to make your own opinions as well. I've subscribed to The Boring News and I find it extremely valuable. It's how I start my mornings. So go ahead and subscribe to The Boring News. That's boringnews.co. You won't regret it. It's again a very smart thing to do, right? One is to ride on existing trends and adjacent markets, and the other is to sort of position what you're different about as a unique selling proposition, right? So pretty fantastic. Now let's talk about the back end, what happens on the logistics and supply chain side of things. As you say it, farm to future, right? So what goes into all of this various products that you have?
No, that's a great question. I think it's very important to understand how the logistics and supply chain is placed today in India for hemp seed-based products or hemp fiber-based textile products or cannabis leaf-based Ayurvedic formulations as well. But today, a large chunk of the supply is still coming from natural sources. The biggest problem has been that to grow any crop, you need a standard seed to put in your ground that will give you a standard yield, that will give you a standard rate. And that has been the biggest gap in farming communities. And that's where we undertook a mission many years ago, and when the final phases of it is we partnered with CSI and institutes to actually breed these types of seed varieties that farmers can begin scaling in large agriculture domains as well. But from the supply mechanism, we work closely with farmers and collectors from states like Uttarakhand to source our seeds as well as our fibers, as well as other hilly states to source it directly for them, where we predetermine sort of an MSP basis, the season, as well as other variables and factors, as well as the close relationship and our need and our want to be able to boost their income and sort of boost their productivity as well. And we combine this very closely with the cannabis leaf, or what we call bhang in India, which we source from state excise departments, where basically all the leaf and bhang that is sourced across India is basically sourced from natural growing plants. So they pick the leaf and they collect it, and their collectors are paid a certain amount by state government. They then supply to another state government who offers it to license holders, manufacturing license holders, on a annual quota basis. There's certain tons, how much requirement for certain license-based classical as well as proprietary Ayurvedic formulations, one, as well as your bhanka takas, number two, which is of course, the retail, the recreational side, which we're not concerned with. That is where we realized the entire logistics and supply chain of this is so extremely diverse and scattered that at the onset it is almost impossible to centralize. You would have to work interstate from one state to the other, where even when it's crossing a state, you would have to have the right paperwork and documents in place to be able to create those documents. Work with state governments for one guy to recognize what the other guy is doing was equally instrumental to even get the raw material to your factory. Once it got to the factory for, say, a seed or leaf based product, we realized that fortunately in India, one thing that, as much as software and software technology is great, there is an equal amount of very strong manufacturing technology at the baseline. Processing, extraction, dehulling of seeds, taking leaves and then extracting a different oil or a different tincture out of it. There were existing mechanisms in the ecosystem that didn't require vast or rapid rebuilding. Of course, it require modernizing in the future as the standards get higher and the need from consumers changes and evolves and adapts as well. But for the existing marketplace, the infrastructure was very strong. The key was having the relevant licensing to have the raw material actually touch your factory that is licensed to hold it and convert it into an end finished product, as well as having your packaging and labeling absolutely correct, where the claims you make are very important. How you represent what messaging you're saying are very important. For example, for hemp food based products, we're working with the Food Safety Standards Authority of India. And one of the key requirements is the leaf and the flower cannot be represented in marketing packaging because it's a very misdirectionary messaging to a consumer, that they're thinking, oh, it's cannabis, but it's actually a hemp seed based food product, and it's sort of bad faith, acting in bad faith. It's a similar mechanism for Ayurvedic proprietary medicines, where certain, I would say, compliances are very important for you to do basic safety data. Actually collect data to see how it's proven, how it's efficacious. Work with research institutions to do clinical studies and clinical trials. So for us, we realize the process doesn't end at actually making the product. That's where half of the journey begins. The rest of the journey is validating the findings from what you've made. Actually having analytical certificates, actually having cannabinoid testing to say how much THC or CBD is there in your Ayush formulation, doing the relevant microbial or stability testing on your hemp seeds to say that there are no microbes or toxins or extra chemicals that are coming from the soil. Having all of that in the logistics and supply chain, we realized was very critical to build it in a much more vertically integrated manner as compared to today, as compared to recently till today, where it's been a lot more scattered, it's been a lot more divergent. You're going to have to get multiple stakeholders to meet at a common platform to drive it in a much clearer direction. But this is an antithesis of how, for example, a textile would work, where the textile, the biggest issue was not the manufacturing, it was the raw material, the lack of quality of it. So you had to strip for example, in villages, when it comes to hemp fiber, the primitive method of separation used to be, you used to put the fiber in cold water in the river and then pick it out and then tear it with your teeth. Okay, first of all, that's bad for your health. And second of all, even the quality of the fiber suffers. So even the income output of this can be deeply compromised. Being able to correct those and standardize those mechanisms, where we work very closely with former ministers of textiles to have decortication units set up, or other manufacturing units set up to have the inner and outer fiber separated, converted into a very soft cotton like fiber, changed into the yarn and then taken into the garment. And fortunately, because of the very strong textile ecosystem in India, we were able to do so in a very seamless manner. The next grade in the scale up is where the challenges became even more manifold. That is, what designs work. Should you look at only fabric? Should you look at only yarn? Should you do only B2B, only B2C? Should you take it to end garment, if end garment, online or offline? And being able to stabilize the entire value chain, which we were very successful in doing, where we actually have three properties. One is Boheco Textiles that works on the yarn and the raw cotton fiber, that is working large B2B with some of the top textile companies today, where we supply them and we engage with them. We have a hemp fabric lab that has the largest repository of hemp fabrics in the world, and a B label, which was the first hemp-based sustainable fashion label launched in India. So it was a key about being able to see how, if you've ever seen sort of how a juggler works, sometimes you have to be able to juggle and anticipate the movements of what is to come next. And that's why we realized working in three ecosystems for three separate industries, tackling the challenges actually required concerted effort of six co-founders working in different directions all the time. So that's how the logistics and supply chain has shaped up over the course. As I said, that the infrastructure exists, it does need to be modernized from time to time. But the real battle is the raw material, the licensing and compliance, and then after you take the product, or when you take the product to market, how do you validate your findings that this product is indeed worth its claims or indeed worth the packaging and labeling it stands?
Right. So as you're describing all of the processes, right? I mean, I was just thinking that you must have to deal with a ton of regulation, right? I mean, on various different fronts, food, medical, textiles, etc. Not to forget the whole factory setup and everything. How are you dealing with regulators, and any advice on entrepreneurs who are listening to this who may have to do it in their own industries and spaces?
That's a great question. I think it's a very important one for all aspiring entrepreneurs many who are operating in gray area to work on things that don't exist yet in policy and law. And the constant and consistent as well as humble engagement with technocrats, bureaucrats, and policymakers is critical. When it comes to cannabis, because cannabis is actually covered under the ambit of multiple agencies, whether it's the Narcotic Control Bureau under Ministry of Home Affairs, your CBN under Central Bureau of Narcotics in the Ministry of Finance. You have your state narcotic bodies and your excise bodies working with the Ministry of Health, Ministry of Ayush, Textile, Agriculture, etc. It is important to compartmentalize your narrative and conversation to objectives you want to achieve. The key is the story that you're going to present that is not only benefiting yourselves, but is benefiting the larger ecosystem. So when it began, it was Boheco, but the goal was always how many thousands of farmers, hundreds of artisans, thousands of patients, hundreds of doctors can be benefited from this. Because that is what is going to take India to your $5 trillion economy goal. How do you grow and expand a pie that wasn't even there in the first place? And that's where policymakers and regulators, unfortunately, a lot of startups underestimate their intellectual capability. Some of the policymakers we have worked with are some of the finest minds we have ever seen in our lifetime. They were always ahead of the game, far-sighted enough to see the vision of young entrepreneurs. And I remember the first time we did a meeting, a couple of us in Delhi, we had a meeting, as I mentioned, with senior narcotic officials, etc. The first question out of their mouth after we pitched is, how old are you? And he said, we're 22. And he started laughing. And he said, okay, this is the world we live in. And the key behind working with policymakers and bureaucrats is, first, you have to build the message of what is the larger mission you want to accomplish. The key to understand is, the onus is not on the policymaker or bureaucrat to execute it. The onus is on us as startup enterprises to take it 99 steps of the way. The support of the ecosystem will be that one step of the way to say, you know what, I'm with you. When this proposal comes to my desk, don't worry, it will be taken care of, it will be passed, and a lot more people will benefit out of this. So over the course of years, we've always tried to have that meaningful dialogues one-on-one. We've actually worked very closely even with bodies like Niti Aayog and the Vice Chairman's office, all the way across multiple ministries, several state departments. We're currently engaged with almost 6 state governments and their chief ministers to create policies. We've assisted one, now we're in the final throes of about 3 or 4 more states. And one thing to realize, it is a game of patience and process, because it will take almost 1 to 3 years for a new, unique, radical and risky idea to actually embed in the minds positively. Because it's not one ecosystem or policymaker, they are educating others, and others will have pushback. And then it's important to approach the others to give the narrative that fits and understand how each part plays in the ecosystem. Where it's not everyone is stepping on each other's toes. Every department and ministry has a role to play in the upliftment of the larger industry and ecosystem. And being able to show the role that they have and the positive nature and they have in gaining their support. Because support is not something that comes immediately. We were very fortunate. I remember, I'll give you an example, the state of Himachal Pradesh. Our discussion began in 2015-16. I was invited to a conference organized by one of India's top think tank bodies around drug abuse and narcotics and psychotropics. And some of them are still our advisors and mentors still today, former narcotic commissioners, senior IRS officers, etc. We went to the conference. I met the chief minister, and I had a presentation. And the presentation explained the entire myriad of hemp and cannabis. So there are 15,000 industrial uses across 18 different industries. This grows in your backyard. This is your strategic tool. And I remember the principal secretary of horticulture, who's now a very dear friend and dear mentor and advisor. He was right after me. He was going to present a case on apple farming and the horticulture value of this. As soon as I've done my presentation, the first thing he gets up and says is, after the presentation, I'm not sure if we should speak about apple farming. Maybe hemp and cannabis is the way to go. That was 2016. 2019-20 is when we were invited back by the state government of Himachal Pradesh with under the guidance of the same officer who had also been promoted and was now working closely with the chief minister, as well as other senior MLAs and ministers, to build that support and narrative. And immediately the support is there. And one thing I've realized is the bipartisan nature is very important. That you have to have a buy-in from all sides, regardless of who's in administration, who's in opposition. That should not matter. The goal is progress, and being able to define that goal in an objective manner. This is what you'll achieve. This is the benefit of a state. This is the type of taxation or revenue the government can gain directly. This is the indirect benefits the government can gain by enabling more farming, agrarian, manufacturing, processing, consumers, patients, doctors, etc. And once they are completely enthralled and understanding of the entire messaging of how deep, and I would say very deep and kind of complex this ecosystem could be, and the importance of their role in ecosystem and empower their importance and role, is when they will reflect positively on you. But again, it's about patience and humility. You have to walk 99 steps of the way. They will assist you over that one step of the way. And it's a game of repeating and reiterating what you're doing and how that is going to not just benefit oneself, but benefit others in the process. And that's one thing I've realized, whether it's your Ministry of Agriculture, Ministry of Textiles, Ministry of Finance. For example, I remember there was we had met the Director General that time of ICL, the Top Agriculture Research Institute, and we explained to him and the value, etc. And he said, he asked me one question. He said, do you know why, even though we have so much food stored in FCI godowns and warehouses, so much of India goes starving? I said, why? He said, we don't have enough gunny sacks to keep the food in, because there are not enough producers, there's not an ecosystem, because all of it is jute. And jute is sort of like a crop that is stagnating because no one wants to get in the industry. So the food lies on the warehouse floor, rats get into it, and it's not possible to give to rural communities. Simple problems like that can be solved through simple solutions. And being able to customize what you're doing to be able to assist with those solutions and give them that scope of how this is hope. As we say, it's hope, not dope, in a lot of the narrative. A lot of policymakers, regulators have really understood the value of this. And they themselves are very mature, because we have to keep in mind the IPS, IRS, IAS, political machinery, bureaucrats, they travel globally. They're going overseas. They're seeing in Europe what's happening. They see the China multi-billion-dollar CBD and hemp fiber and hemp seed market. They're not oblivious to this. Their big key question is, how do we do this in India? And if you are able to give them that position and stance of India doing something as good, if not better than the world, that really, really plays into how India's future can be unlocked in a much larger fashion. So I'd definitely say patience, persistence, humility, and showing a bit of compassion to the political and bureaucratic machinery, because they are very overworked. They're extremely productive people, and it's important to understand where they come from.
Right. Yeah, I mean, spot on, right? I mean, I think when you're an innovator or when you're a startup person, I mean, you kind of look at the other side as people who are very rigid and who are, set in their ways, right? But actually, regulation is perhaps the hardest thing to do, right? I mean, it's very, very hard. It's very complex, and we don't really understand the full consequence of any policy or anything that comes out until it's out there. So a lot of these unintended consequences can happen as well. So, and I think Indian regulators have been fairly proactive, right? I mean, if you look at, payments, for example, or, other spheres as well, we've been fairly proactive on that front. One of the larger messages that you are trying to sell, obviously, to the policy makers also is the fact that you're creating livelihoods, creating micro entrepreneurs, and so on and so forth, right? So talk to us about your experience working with farmers, artisans in these various places, the kind of energy they bring to the table, and how their lives have transformed.
No, that's a great question, Roshan. And I would say it has been a beautifully humbling but a very enlightening experience. Because one thing, end of the day, we were born and brought up city boys. We have the privilege of being part of the very privileged class. And we always felt the conscious need to be able to give back in a productive manner, even when we began Boheco. So that's where, even when we began our journey, we used to spend months in the most rural interiors of Uttarakhand, where, it's almost impossible for cars to even get up the slope. We would travel there, we spend time there. We'd build and engage relationships with different collectors, different artisans, different farming community. When we began, I remember there were barely 10, 15 to 25 women artisans who were working on handloom based hemp products, and we were combining it with nettle, what we call vichugas, another natural fiber, and getting some fantastic results. We said, rather than just being, the urban boys who come and say, oh, you should do this, or you should do that, first learn from them. Come on, first understand their challenges. First understand where they're coming from. See how you can benefit them in the best way possible. And of course, in turn, you will benefit. Value creation isn't only about a monetary or sort of like a PR narrative based value creation. It's about actually creating value in salt of the earth. And that's why even we've had many mistakes and learnings. For example, when we the first income that was generated from sort of the women artisans and farmers, one of the first mistakes is, instead of providing the women with the income that they earned and deserve, we gave it to the family and the households. Many families and households put it into, I would say, risky or almost dead investments. Some put it into fueling their addictions, etc. And most unfortunately came from the men of the household, the young men of the household, gambling or alcohol, etc. And the women artisans were rightly angry with us. And why would you do this? We almost kicked out of different areas. That's why we had to spend even more time. We doubled down, spend time in the villages, understood how we can benefit them. What are the technical value additions? What are the strategic value additions? How we can take their message from a rural hinterland into urban cities, into the offices of government, show them what is actually happening in India's backyard, which was very, very critical to be able to drive their optimism in the future of this crop and plant as well. So when we began, there were 15 to 25 women artisans. We were very privileged to engage with the ecosystem. Where I think today it's almost upwards of at minimum 500 to almost 1,000 plus artisans that and collectors
Wow.
and farmers who are working on it. Some of them have never seen income like this in their life. To actually just working on collecting and aggregating hemp seeds and hemp seed oil. They are able to build houses. They are able to develop their own villages. They don't need to migrate. The goal is reverse migration. Why shouldn't the villages in the peri-urban towns be the ones defining the new India? Why shouldn't the smart cities be these peri-urban towns and villages, etc.? They should be able to be enabled. Always the problem was logistics. How do you get machinery and capex, etc., up to them? But sometimes, if you are able to design an entire structure and process in a unique manner, working with those stakeholders, you're able to understand some types of capex are may not necessary. There you can be nimble with the type of technologies you use, the type of units you use, the type of goals of products you want to achieve, and being able to really strike at the troika of that was very, very critical. Still today, in fact, one of my co-founders is right now in Uttarakhand, still in a rural part of Uttarakhand. Every year we spend months there. We engage with the ecosystem. We've done the same with several hilly states, where we realize Uttarakhand is still one, the first state with the policy. Other states are coming up with policies. So the importance of getting the farming community to understand that this is of value to them, how it's of value to them. We're not a fly-by-night operator that we're going to disappear with your money overnight. These are small things that we don't factor in, sitting in urban cities. But these things mean the world in rural villages. Trust, faith. And it takes time to build trust. It takes effort and energy. You have to really open yourselves up personally and professionally to show them your good intention. And if they see it and they really value it, you will work side by side, I would say, almost for decades to come. And that was the critical part. That even till today, building trust is a key part of how we work at the back end of working with farmers, artisans, collectors, etc., where a lot of the narrative and even content is telling the stories that there is a woman artisan, and a lot of these women artisans unfortunately lost the male members of the family in the 2011 floods that happened in Uttarakhand and the follow-up floods that happened. So the only breadwinners who had no education, no direct skills, and no capacity. There's no factories, there's no units. So you have to start from scratch. And telling them there is a plant in your own backyard, we will help you take it to market. You will be the message, the core message, working in tandem with us. And staying consistent to that message is the most critical part of how trust and being able to build that kind of bond with rural communities should take forward, especially for agri entrepreneurs. It's very, very important to keep in mind that the agriculture community is about 60, 65% of the population, but it's only about 15, 17% of the GDP. But what if those agrarians would be taken into agribusiness, agro manufacturing, in a localized, innovative, indigenized fashion that suits their capabilities, where they don't have to go to city to do it. They can do it from the peri-urban towns and maximize value. And being able to deliver on that messaging time and time again, repeatedly and consistently, is a very, very key part of it. Because even one time you slip, you're going to invite attention and scrutiny. We've seen this with quite a few operators and quite a few organizations in many different domains and territories, and we've learned our lessons. We've seen many burn their fingers in very unique domains. For example, Jethrofa. How much time Jethrofa took to be bred, commercialized? It's a Venezuelan crop to make biofuel in India. The first promise was 30% yield from the seed oil. It was 1% for the first 8 years. And they spent thousands of crores of government. The villagers stopped believing. But in states like Chhattisgarh, where the state government really took over, they began to enable the ecosystem. Where I believe the last I heard a couple of years ago, almost all the state government vehicles are powered by Jethro for biofuel. So it takes time, it takes effort, it takes constant engagement to build that relationship where that trust can continue to be valued and enhanced. And it's important to maintain that in a repeated fashion.
Right. A big part of that GDP contribution going up will come from leveraging technology to increase productivity and yield and things to that effect, right? So can you talk to us about, few examples of how you are leveraging technology?
Absolutely. So I think there are different domains. The technology we aim to kind of really value is in three parts of the spectrum. One is at the back end of the spectrum of the vertical supply chain. One is in the middle out, and one is at the front end. When I speak of back end, I speak of actually working on tissue culture and breeding technologies and techniques to actually have seeds that farmers can grow, which is the first big challenge. Where hemp is today is where we were with rice in the pre-1960s, before the Green Revolution, where basmati used to be and a different rice varieties used to be taken from jungles, from natural reserves, and people used to bring it into their farms and fields. It was only through Norman Boiler and like Dr. K.V. Prabhu and a lot of the top scientists at IRI, Dr. Swaminathan, of course, who actually took it into commercializing and breeding it and taking it to scale. And that's where unique technologies working with CSR institutes under the Ministry of Science and Technology on one-of-a-kind research licenses in states like Uttar Pradesh, where we work with the National Botanical Research Institute, Jammu and Kashmir, where we engage with the Indian Institute of Integrative Medicine, or even in Uttarakhand, where we engage with the Ministry of Environment and Forest Institute at GB Pant in Almora. Having that constant cycle of repeatability to first collect almost 300 different land races, which as part of Boheco's seed bank, we've collected from almost say 15 to 16 different states, doing that expedition every year, taking it into field, doing the kind of tissue culture, crossing one variety with the other, understanding the phenotype and chemotype, saying this is good for fiber, this is good for seed, this can grow well outdoors, this can grow well in poly houses. And having multiple generations of that breeding is a key part of the baseline at the back end of the cultivation-based integrated technology, where a lot of our core mission has always been from a scientific end. From the middle perspective, we focus a lot on technological interventions, even from our hemp seed-based or a cannabis leaf-based Ayurvedic formulations, to take it from early days, generation one based form factors, from your extracts and tinctures, etc., from your basic oils, into newest products. For example, roll-ons or spray-based technology, where you can actually apply it topically, having it encapsulated, exploring nano-emulsifying techniques to increase the bioavailability of how much CBD or THC goes into your body. And actually working on this to be able to have a value addition that proves worthwhile to a patient or a consumer or a doctor in the long run. And then there's the front end of it. The front end of it is where there are three key principles: safe, not toxic, and efficacious. What you're having is safe, what you're having is not toxic to your body, and what you're having works. And that's where we're very fortunate enough. Technology enablement in the medical and clinical study space. We are actually the first organization to have cannabis-based human-grade clinical studies registered on this clinical trial database that are approved by the Drug Controller General of India. We have an academic study, the first of its kind, using cannabis flower, imported globally, being studied at Tata Memorial Center on stage 2 breast cancer patients to understand its expression on a neoplasm or a tumor perioperative. Majorly because there is a prevalent theory that it activates certain endocannabinoids like anandamide, etc., that would enable the neoplasm or the tumor to react in a different mechanism, and you could kind of stabilize it during operations, etc. Similarly, we have other clinical studies at the National Institute of Ayurveda on stress, stress management, sleep management, skin health, osteoarthritis pain. We have upcoming studies on chronic pain and non-cancer and cancer-based patients. So as you see that for us, technology wasn't only about the hardware tech in one aspect of the value chain or the other. It was the entire value chain itself, where we had to create strategic moats that would value enhance what we're doing, whether it's breeding of seeds that farmers can grow, whether it's adopting new form factors and processing technologies to make it more sophisticated and more valuable to patients and consumers, and then taking that into clinical studies and human studies as well as animal studies, where we're the first company to actually do single dose toxicity studies to show cannabis leaf, that is THC and CBD, very high percentage of CBD is actually non-toxic on white mice, which is a huge achievement because this data and all of this compendium matters in the long run. And while we do that, we also complemented with a lot of the back end of our online mechanisms as well. And what we have seen even in our online mechanisms that there's huge sort of outreach in terms of how to build, sort of like a D2C slash CAS, cannabis as a service to many in different forms and platforms and manners. Because for some it's about products, for some it's about education, for some it's about both of these. And I think that might have also been highlighted is basically a lot of it is looking at the frontier. What's the future? For example, we had one of our projects which got incubated at Singularity University and received a lot of praise from even the likes of Ray Kurzweil, was using waste of the hemp fiber and converting it and sort of using a proprietary process to convert it into a nanocarbon or a carbon nanosheet, which actually had graphene layers. So you could use that technically in, I would say, supercapacitors, semiconductors, electronics, technology. We supplied this material to the likes of Apple, Google, Tesla, Samsung to actually do skunk works on it. Figure out the R&D of where this could fit, where it form fits and matches, and we have a patent pending of that in India. So technology has been a key part of our everydays, what we live and breathe, and we're always finding ways to value enhance because we realize it has to be a very sort of multilateral approach to engagement and enhancement of tech-based resources for us.
Wow. The sheer amount of effort you put to sort of verticalize all of these different things, right? Whether it's customer acquisition, whether it's dealing with policymakers, the back end, everything, even communication, right? It's just phenomenal. And don't you get tired? I mean, like you're revisiting everything, right? I mean, you're discovering everything through first principles. And I had an entrepreneur on the podcast once who said, I wish I had some competition, when in a previous stint, right? Because at least there is that pace to, watch your back and then kind of see sideways as well. And there is some sort of a precedence, okay, they are doing some X feature. I mean, we should probably do something similar or something like that, right? I mean, here, I think everything is being driven from Boheco itself. So I think this could be a great primer for people on how to operate in a very nascent space, right? So what would your advice be? Some top 2 or 3 things that people can take back?
I think one of the advices and edicts I really stuck by was a quote from Winston Churchill. I don't know, somehow it stuck in my mind. It says, if you're going through hell, keep going. And I think that's a key first principle of entrepreneurs. We're all going to go through the stage. You can see the bags under my eyes. I'm exhausted. Well, all of us are exhausted. But what drives us is to wake up every day, the sheer passion that you feel of driving an ecosystem, but making a team while you're doing it. Because when we began it, 7 founders, we didn't earn our own salaries, we bootstrapped ourselves. We were fortunate enough that the likes of Mr. Tata, Mr. Anandan believed in our mission, helped us really build credibility over the course of time. But today we're managing a team of 30 of our own employees, and it's sort of like a dream. You woke up and it just happened overnight. And that's the key part of it, that it's always important to ride the waves, whether it's a crest or a trough, because it's constant. You're always going to have the ups and the downs. There are days where we would be touching the moon, but within an hour, we'd be skyrocketing downwards. And being able to balance that, and I think a key part of that is how grounded you continue to remain. That no matter how much, and I think, this is sort of a fallacy a lot of startups go through, that we have no competitors. Competitors are around you directly or indirectly, you just don't see it yet. And that is a key facet of understanding entrepreneurship. And there's something I always believe in, it's better to be paranoid than dead. And sometimes it's important to be paranoid about competitors that are far off in your horizon, but they're coming and you're ready for them when they come. Because every competitor will come in a different scale. They'll come in an indirect or a direct manner. And sometimes they're not even going at you. They have another mission, they have their own vision, they have their own company, they have their own goals to achieve. But somehow, some way is going to step on your toes. The key is always to understand how can you drive value better. And most importantly, because we are a cost sensitive economy, how can you drive price to a certain stability? Not, you don't have to be dirt cheap. That mentality is sort of going away. People are willing to pay if you're giving them quality, and most importantly, after quality, you're not leaving them high and dry. You're there to answer their questions, handhold them through what they want, and give them a journey. People are not just looking for products or a service, they're looking for a journey and an experience. And that's sort of what we're really playing into, the experiential journey that people will take with hemp and cannabis that could transform their lives. So definitely, of course, that's, I remember in Singularity University says, somebody said, being an entrepreneur is like building a plane as it's in the sky. And it feels like that most of the day, but it has to be done. Sometimes you have to build self-fulfilling prophecies and then go and then reverse integrate that prophecy. And it's part of the job. And the key part is, I think one of the biggest values is always finding a team to do it. When you're trying to do too much on your own, you're not going to achieve much. You'll push 2%, 3%, 5% in few directions, and you'll be 7 years later and you're not gone anywhere. But with the right team and being humble enough to say, okay, I may be good at something, but someone is better, and empowering them to go forward and go as fast as they can with that. But while also having a common consensus is a very critical part of the feedback loop mechanism internally that entrepreneurs need to create by A, building a team, and B, empowering the team to take their own decisions, but critically appraising them in an objective manner, keeping personal relationships aside, purely focused on what the larger mission and vision is. So I definitely say that's a key part of it, that competitors exist, you just don't see them yet. That's why it's important to be paranoid and start hunting from them from the onset so that you know what you're going to be dealing with, whether it's an 800-pound gorilla or whether it's a tiger lurking behind the next tree.
Right. And I think you're building a hell of a moat actually with everything that you're doing. So that's awesome. I think when you think about the future, I think there's this Bezos quote which I really like. He says, look for things that are unchanging. In Amazon's context, he says, even 10 years or 20 years down the line, no customer will say, I want to pay more for something, or if you could delay this delivery a little more, right? So which is why everything that Amazon does sort of pivots around these two things. So yeah, spoke about having 7 founders, right? I mean, I know founding teams of 3 or 4 that look bloated. I mean, and obviously, I mean, when 4 people or 5 people are involved, there's that old saying, right? I mean, too many cooks spoil the broth. So how do you ensure you work in an optimal way? Because that part you mentioned about team is so important, because a great team is like 1 + 1 = 3 or 10 sort of a situation. Whereas a bad team, I mean, you can hardly get anything done, right? So when you have 7 founders, how do you sort of work together? How do you leverage each other's strengths?
A lot of the learnings and lessons were very organic because it's first generation naturally in the cannabis and hemp industry globally to have so many founders. But we also trace back a little more historically. For example, Fairchild Semiconductors was one of the first very successful organizations that had 6 to 8 co-founders. How they undertook their journey, how at times many founders, and the key is always having that amiable spirit, because end of the day, 100% consensus all the time is impossible. And pushing for that will delay your mission and your larger vision and goals. Sometimes it's important to understand what are decisions that can be taken in smaller teams. And that's why building cohorts, committees, and subcommittees to, for example, work on policy regulation, to work on product development, to work on research, to work on business development, marketing, to work on the larger strategy. Creating those, I would say, smaller cohorts in the larger vessel is very, very critical, where those cohorts shouldn't become echo chambers, where it's just one agreeing with the other. They need to be tested and hypothesized. A stress test is very, very critical when you're evaluating or praising a certain decision. And that's why even at the founder level, one of the key areas has always been being able to enable other founders to take steps, take calls on their own, and being able to back them up and justify them at the right time. But equally with that, because it's sort of not just a one-way stream, the equal part is maintaining a certain degree of equanimity. That is, not one person has one thing all the time and is only driving only one thing all the time, because we don't want someone to become just only a master of one space. Everyone at Boheco and everyone of the founder team knows a little bit or a lot about almost every area and domain we're working with. And that constant engagement, for example, our policy team and our research team is always engaged with the market team to tell them what's happening. Our market and BD team is always engaged with us to tell us what are their findings, what are their learnings, because there will always be hidden gaps that may be outside the box perspective of a certain silo, of a certain cohort. So being able to match the goals of a cohort and how they drive consensus or certain goals and objectives with being able to have the added complement of an external lens, albeit from an internal team at a founder level, and having that kind of AB mechanism is a very, very critical part of how to drive it. And that's why seven of us already knew where areas we operate. For example, I work on strategy and collaboration. So I work across the value chain in different areas. One of my founders is only focused on the legal side and the policy side. One only focused on supply chain operations, one on research. We have a CEO and then a CMO and business development officer, etc. But every month we have a 3-hour session where we understand where we are, how we're going, where do we need to go. Every 2 weeks, smaller teams and cohorts meet. So that consistency of meeting, engaging, and most importantly, not shunning contrary opinions, accepting contrary opinions, seeing if they fit, trying it, stress test it. If it fits, and great, a new way. If it doesn't, no worries, we'll find another way. And being able to have that healthy mechanism is a very critical part.
Right. Wow, this has been a fascinating conversation, Jahan, and really, I could go on for another hour. But, just to end the podcast, what are some high-level challenges that you're trying to solve for right now? And, what are you most optimistic about, going forward?
I think we're aiming to solve multiple high-level challenges. One of the key ones is establishing and sort of bringing forward the historical and cultural relevance of cannabis into a more modern scientific setting. As I mentioned, clinical studies, clinical data, and trials. The importance to show that cannabis can be used as a medicine for your pain, for your stress, for anxiety, touching touch points and changing patients' lives. So, for example, we have patients who have testicular cancer or glioblastoma, who have had tuberculosis or HIV, who have actually benefited. 6 to 12 months later, there are patients who had Parkinson's, had mild dyskinesia, were not able to walk today. They are able to go to the vegetable market on their own, buy their own vegetables and come back home. And for them, these small moments of pride are everything. To enable these small moments of pride for millions of patients, millions of consumers, thousands of doctors is a key ethos of what really, really drives us. To show cannabis is safe and it works in efficacious settings. And most importantly, our goal is someday to have lakhs of farmers, to have almost every state government having policies. And the way we see it is, the country that really, really deserves admiration is China. Their approach of how they broke provinces and districts, where today one province grows only hemp for fiber, one grows only for seed, one grows only for medical, one grows only for leaf. Their market is thriving. There are farmers who have been taken, there are almost 300,000 plus farmers taken above the poverty line in less than 10 years with one plant and one crop. The way we see it is, we call it Kalpavriksh, the one plant for many different uses. To be able to really stay true of the messaging of what cannabis is, the high level challenge is building an ecosystem that is able to grapple with that. An ecosystem that is to someday say, hey, can we grow hemp alongside cotton? Can we grow hemp seed oil alongside your palm seed? Can we grow medical cannabis for all the patients in my state who are facing a wide abundance of issues rather than growing another conventional crop that doesn't have that same value? That type of story and that type of ecosystem is the legacy we're trying to build. We're not aiming, when we started this mission, it was very clear. And I remember we set this mandate. Most companies set a 10-year, 25-year vision. We set a 200-year vision. That this company has to be over 200, 250 years, in 10 years, in 25 years, in 50 years, in 75 years, in 125 years, in 150 years. This is what we want to accomplish. So that is where the baseline of stream of thought really evolved from us, where we want to be a centuries-old legacy that really challenges the ecosystem in a healthy way, but establishes cannabis at the apex of an Indian national crop that really belongs to Indian natives and to the nation in a much, much larger way. And use that as a pathway for other plant-based and entheogenic-based alternatives and innovations to be pursued, to make people dream, to have other entrepreneurs come up with radical ideas today, say, can I make a sanitary pad out of him? Or can I make mufflers for my two-wheeler out of him? By the way, these two ideas are already done. We've engaged with entrepreneurs. That type of ecosystem is the most healthily challenging ecosystem. So I would say those are the high-level challenges we aim to bring and be able to have India at the apex of the global geopolitical cannabis and hemp economy within the next 50 to 75 years.
I really love how deliberate you are about everything that you do, and that long-term thinking kind of reflects in everything that you're doing, right? I mean, it shows in the amount of effort that you're putting along each of these various axes that we spoke about. Before we leave you, any favorite books and podcasts that you would recommend to our listeners?
Honestly, you can see from the bags under my eyes, books have been and podcasts have been few and far between. But off the top of my head, I think the couple that really strike me, that really I took a lot from, whether I would say implicitly or sort of covertly in my subconscious, or more overt manner, whether it's Yuval Noah Harari, Sapiens, whether it's Black Swan or Fooled by Randomness by Nicholas Taleb, because these were things that tested a challenge in the mind of unique, unorthodox events that have not yet occurred. How can you plan and build into the future? And of course, How to Create a Mind by Ray Kurzweil is another one that stands out immediately. How do you aim to get to the singularity? Can we reach a day where you have your hemp graphene powering batteries, solar powered batteries that change the solar economy? Can you have hemp based graphitic nanobots that control your brains? How far can this go? There's no limit. I think maybe one of the podcasts that stands out is, of course, Beginning of Infinity by Novel. That sort of really stands out more actively as well. But I like to feed myself that in not large batches, but small batches. So it gives you time to introspect, really kind of take micro learnings and be able to unravel and unbundle them to the context you live in. So yes, these would be a couple of the examples.
All right. So thanks so much, Jahan. This was a pleasure talking to you. Really, really interesting work, and all the best for everything that you have coming up.
Thank you so much, Roshan. It was an absolute pleasure, and greatly looking forward to continued discussions and engagements for the benefit of the hemp and cannabis economy. And the next time we connect, I'm going to make sure you're going to be in a hemp t-shirt, having a bowl of hemp salad, as well as any Ayurvedic medicine or topicals for skin or any other pain-based issues. That's my promise to you.
Looking forward to it. Awesome. Thank you so much for listening. If you liked this episode, then don't forget to subscribe to us on your favorite platform and share this episode with all of your fellow startup operators. Also, follow the Startup Operator on LinkedIn and Twitter for more updates. Stay safe, take care, and see you soon on a brand new episode of the Startup Operator.